All right, let's now listen into reaction coming in on the economic survey from New Delhi.
Individual or a group of individuals. And I'm presenting this on behalf of a number of people. And I'd like to acknowledge some of them. My apologies, I'm going to miss some. In fact, if you look at the acknowledgements page or pages in the survey, it's really quite long, and I'm sure it should have been longer, so apologies. First of all, I'd like to thank the staff of the economic division, my colleagues who are sitting here, my officers of Team CEA, as we call it. I would also like to thank very much the physical act of actually producing it. It takes a lot of effort. I would like to thank the coordinating unit, its head, and especially Aftab and Ashwini for really having seen the process very carefully. Lots of people who are not here have also contributed. Don't want to name all of them, but including some people in the US who came to contribute for this, to work for this. I'd like to thank them as well. I'd like to thank my colleagues who work with me, in the Ministry of Finance, especially the two that I work closest with, Dr. Hasmukh Adhya and Mr. Subhash Garg. I mean, one couldn't ask for better colleagues like that in the ministry to work with. Of course, I would love to thank my boss, the Honorable Finance Minister, without whom, of course, none of this could happen. His support, his guidance, the cover that he provides have just been amazing in making all these 4 surveys that we've done possible. So a very special thanks to him. Last but not least this year, I want to extend a special, very, very special thanks to a group of people who kind of don't get enough, I think, credit for the work that we do. In the last survey and in this survey, we've spoken a lot about how we use big data. And I'm going to show you this year as well. We've used a lot of big data to come up with new facts and evidence. But, we can work with big data only if we get big data. And we get big data, or we've got big data, thanks to numerous colleagues in government, the deputy secretaries, the undersecretaries, the joint secretaries, the directors, in their own quiet ways, they've been helping us enormously. And I'd like to thank 2 people in particular who are here. I want them to stand up, both for themselves, but also for who they represent. Mr. Nilendu Mishra and Mr. Prakash Kumar, please stand up. I'd like to thank, it's people like this who, with their generous time, support, and guidance, who make some of the work possible here. In fact, but for Mr. Kumar and his colleagues in GSTN, a lot of the work which I'm going to show you would not have been possible. Of course, the cover is pink. We just wanted to make sure that we too, in our own small way, contribute to, expressing our support to the movement in favor of women and women's empowerment. In fact, there's a whole chapter in the survey on gender. So with that, let me quickly get to the economic survey itself. This year we have 2 volumes. We've gone back to the tradition. Last year we did it over 2 cycles. I think it confused a lot of people, and therefore we've gone back to 2 volumes. Volume 2 is, of course, the review of what happened over the last year. And in Volume 1, we build upon that to do some in-depth analysis and research and come up with new policy ideas. Overview of this presentation, I'm going to take about 25 minutes and then leave the floor open to questions. Frank, is that a good way of proceeding? I need to judge whether all of you are alert and awake. I don't want to bore you too much. So the presentation, it's in 5 parts: achievements, the analytical review, in particular, understanding the temporary decoupling of the Indian economy. That naturally leads to the outlook for 2017-18, the rest of the year, and the next year, and the policy agenda. If I have time, I want to highlight some of the exciting new research that we've done that's presented in Volume 1. And I want to conclude with some big big thoughts, maybe big and hopeless thoughts, but big thoughts nevertheless. Okay, what are the major achievements this year? I think that I would single out 2 or 3 very prominent ones. The launch of the transformational GST at the stroke of the midnight hour on July 1st. I think what is really important to take away also is the fact, as the finance minister said the other day or yesterday, that not only was it launched, and for something of such scale, complexity and scope, there were bound to be teething challenges. And I think it's fair to say that one of the remarkable things was, the mid-course, the corrective, expeditious actions that were taken, which have led to a kind of stabilization of the GST. Second, I think that, as you all know, from the very first survey onwards, we have spoken about the twin balance sheet challenge, over-indebted firms, or undercapitalized banks, which had kind of held back growth for a long time. We call that the twin balance sheet challenge. I think this year, a series of really very important steps have been taken. The resolution that's underway under the IBC and the NCLT process. And of course, very recently, the recapitalizations, actually the details were announced. I think we think of the twin balance sheet challenge as having 4 R's, recognition, resolution, recapitalization, and reforms. And I think we're now really well ahead on almost all of them. I'll talk about reforms in a couple of seconds, but I think these were very, very important. The binding constraint festering was the twin balance sheet challenge, and I think there's some decisive tackling of that's taken place. So, as validation of these achievements and recognizing India's medium-term prospects, I think for the first time in 14 years, India got the sovereign ratings upgrade, and of course we jumped many, many ranks in the ease of doing business. So these were, I think, quite very important, even transformational achievements this year. As I said, in order to understand what is happening or what's going to happen in the rest of the year and the next year, we really need to understand what happened in the last, 4 to 6 quarters. And I think one way to think about this is to see why the Indian economy decoupled from the rest of the economy for about 4 to 6 quarters. As you can see that, for a period, India was accelerating while the world was decelerating. And then from the middle of 2016, kind of the reverse process happened. And that is a bit of a puzzle, and we need to understand why that happened to see what's going to happen going forward. I think this temporary decoupling happened. We explained that in the overview chapter for 4 reasons. First, I think there was this competitiveness impact from the 2 major policy actions, demonetization and GST. And you can see that, this is not proof, but it's all suggestive evidence that for about 1 to 2 quarters, you can see highlighted in white how exports decelerated very sharply and imports accelerated very sharply. So that was kind of some evidence that there was an impact from the 2 policy actions. Then, of course, beginning in the early to middle of 2016, our interest rates went up very sharply. See how we decoupled from the rest of the world. So interest rates affected demand. In turn, capital came in, strengthened the exchange rate, as you can see on the right-hand side. That also affected our competitiveness. If you look at the trade balance and the services balance, they were affected by that, and that also had a dampening effect on real activity. And this was, again, different from the rest of the world. That's why we kind of decoupled from the rest of the world to some extent. The 4th factor, which I'll talk about later, is, of course, oil prices. Also this year, oil prices went up. That affected consumption and the government finances, and that also held back real economic activity. So these kind of 4 factors contributed to the decoupling. And immediately you can see, therefore, what happens going forward. We see now that there is a robust and broad-based revival. Several indicators of activity. We've shown manufacturing growth, GVA growth, even investment, exports, net private transfers, credit. They've all started to pick up. The direction is very good. The level is still below potential. Should keep that in mind. But in terms of directionally, the economy seems to be picking up quite nicely, quite robustly, and that's what's happening now. So in terms of the short-term outlook, the temporary impact of demonetization and GST have dissipated. Corrective actions have taken. I think the government is injecting a fair amount of demand into the economy. And above all, I think that exports have picked up quite briskly in the last 3 quarters, apart from that dip that I showed you. If you look at that same export chart and look at the last 4 quarters, you will see that Indian growth is about manufacturing export growth is about 11.3%, which is very healthy and kind of broadly in line with the way the world economy is going. So exports are driving growth. The temporary factors are receding. Private investment going forward will depend a lot upon capacity utilization and the progress under the IBC. Consumption, I'm going to come back, is going to be a little bit challenged because of oil prices going forward. So the growth projection, which all of you have already seen, for 17-18, it's 6.75%. It's higher than the CSO's estimate, in large part because the CSO has itself acknowledged that they weren't able to fully take account of recent developments. So I don't think they would be at all, they would contest this projection in any way. 6.75 on the real, and also inflation is higher in the second half than the first half, which they weren't fully able to incorporate. We project nominal GDP growth this year for about 10.5%. And going forward next year, because of all these factors, we think that growth will rise to between 7 and 7.5. You've of course seen the IMF and World Bank projections, so this is in the ballpark. Now, all projections, these are projections, they have a lot of error bands around them. Nobody is perfect. I think there's both upside potential, but there's also challenges and risks that have to be factored in when thinking about this baseline forecast. Export growth could be greater. We find, for example, that exports are growing in line with world growth. There's a kind of a standard elasticity, but that is still lower than what this response of exports was in the previous period. So if export responsiveness picks up, export growth could be higher and overall GDP growth could be higher. And also, I think if the IBC, if they're accepted without any glitches, then I think there is a chance that private investment, after so many years of languishing, could also pick up as well. But in terms of the downside risks, I think that we should all be aware of that, that there are factors that we should be very, very watchful about. If oil prices remain at current levels, I think there will be challenges. We know a rule of thumb, every $10 increase in the price of oil, GDP growth comes down by about 0.2 to 0.3%. The current account deficit will deteriorate by about, again, 0.4 percentage points of GDP, $10 billion. Inflation will be higher also by about 0.2, 0.3%. So I think we need to watch oil prices very carefully. That's a risk. Also, sharp corrections to elevated stock prices. Stock prices are elevated. I'll come back to that in a second. If something sharp happens, I think that's another risk we should. And, having seen emerging market experiences around the world for the last 20, 25 years, I think we should always be watchful when, the macro risks mount, when asset prices are high, that you get this emerging market sudden stall. There's a famous phrase, sudden stop of capital flows. But in India, I think we should worry not about anything serious, but sudden stalls in capital flows, because then macro policies will then have to be tighter. Then you get the classic dilemma between stability and growth, and then has all these consequences. So, in a sense, and you can see oil prices 17-18 this year about 16% higher than last year, which have held back consumption, and the IMF forecast is for another 12% higher growth next year compared to this year. So that's going to be a risk that we have to contend with. So in a sense, if you wanted to, in a nutshell, capture the current macroeconomic conjuncture, it's about both the story of revival and the story of risk. And markets are reflecting that actually beautifully. Stock prices are at record levels, which means that there's expectations of, dynamism going forward, GDP, profit earnings, but interest rates have risen very sharply as well, reflecting concerns about the deficit, oil, slightly higher inflation. So this duality of revival and risk is in some ways the current saga of macroeconomic policy today, which I think we should, take account of very carefully. And of course, there is the story about the elevated stock prices, which also we should factor into account. So in some ways, when people say, what is the policy agenda? And we know that this is a very special year ahead for obvious reasons, which I don't have to go into. So I think that in some ways, my own view is that the government doesn't have to do anything new and radical, etc. Just, finishing what it has started already would be, I think, a very ambitious and a very fantastic agenda to complete. Supporting agriculture, because we know there are stresses in the agricultural sector, which are described in the economic survey. Stabilize the GST. I think that we need to stabilize GST because export refunds, compliance, revenue will still have to be achieve an equilibrium. I think we need to complete the twin balance sheet actions. I think that resolution and recapitalization must be accompanied by reforms to kind of shrink the unviable ones and to signal greater private sector participation in the better ones. Finish privatizing Air India, and no small, no mean task to head off any macroeconomic pressures and the possibility of a sudden stall from rising oil prices and possible. This is not a high probability scenario, but as they say, only the paranoid survive, and so eternal vigilance is the price of macroeconomic stability, which I think we need to have going forward. Now, so if I were you and if I wanted you to, kind of cover a few things tomorrow morning's newspapers, apart from what you may already be intending to do, I think there are 4 or 5 in Chapter 1 very important pieces of new evidence which speak to some of the current macroeconomic policy issues. For example, we find that since November 2016, there's been a big increase in individual income tax filers of about 1.8 million new and additional over and above trend growth. The number of GST taxpayers has increased by about 50%, and there's also been some nice boost to individual income tax collections, which are described in box 2. Second very important thing about understanding GST revenues, when the GST numbers for January came out, 2 newspapers had exactly the opposite interpretations of the data, and I want to give you the definitive interpretation of the data that you must go away with. You may ignore me if you want, but you must go away with this, which is the following. Interpreting GST revenues has been really confused, complicated, 11 months, 12 months, IGST, CGST, etc., etc. Forget all of that. If you want to see how the GST is doing, look at what were the pre-GST revenues, which was something like, I think the number is 9.6 million in 2016-17, and what is the total sum of GST revenues this year, and then you have to make some adjustments for one-off factors. If you do that, we find that GST revenues are growing at about 12%, and the buoyancy is well above historical. So for such the early experience of such a transformative change is already providing fairly buoyant revenues. So I think the promise going forward is very good. Similarly, I think we showed that the textile package had some important effects on one particular sector, ready-made garments, not all, which you should look at. One point I want to emphasize to all those market watchers here is that our view is that markets are misinterpreting the borrowing by central and state governments. Markets kind of correlate in a one-to-one fashion market borrowings with the underlying fiscal deficit. In India, that's not quite right. In fact, it's wrong. You should read box 8. And our estimate is that about 40,000 crores of extra borrowing by the center and the states does not reflect the underlying deficit by either of these. So I think that's an important message. It's also, for me, it's a valuable learning experience to understand how to think about borrowing, the deficits, and other aspects of our fiscal arrangements. Last, important, there's a whole 3.5-page box on how to think about the Indian stock market boom. It is different from what's going on around the world, but for very different reasons. And you should read up that. But I think that what the takeaway from that is that there is no room for complacency on this level of asset prices. We need heightened vigilance. Boredom level on a scale of 0 to 10 is 0 or 10? Stamina for 10 to 10 minutes, 15 minutes? Yeah? I take it yes? Yes? Yes, yes. Not from this side, that side. Okay. So I want to highlight some new analysis and research that we've done. Not everything, but a few highlights. I think that, you know, if you read chapter 2 on the GST, again, thanks to the cooperation we got, I learned 8 things about the Indian economy that I did not know. I mean, it's just amazing how much the GST is going to, forget about taxes, revenues, buoyancies, etc. Our understanding of the Indian economy is going to increase by an order of magnitude, and we have some early samplers from that. For example, you know, I told you about the increase in indirect taxpayers. Also, how many, you know, taxpayers filed under the GST who did not have to file, who did not have to be part of the composition scheme. Huge numbers. For the first time, I think we have estimates of the size of the formal sector in India. Formal sector employment, formal sector economic activity. And I think I was blown away. So for example, if you take the stock of formal employment in the non-agricultural sector, our estimate is that between 30 and 50% of this workforce is employed in the formal sector. It's a stock estimate, not a flow estimate. Similarly, if you look at the structure of exports in India, very unusual, very different from other countries. For the first time ever in the history.
The latest on the economic survey there being presented in New Delhi. Of course, we'll be cutting in back and forth and getting you more updates as we speak, including updates coming in prior to budget day.
When you say what should the government do, they say tax the super rich. Yeah. Exactly what you're saying. And what is missing in India, very strangely, is that we have no taxes on wealth at all, which is exploding. We are now the second most unequal country after Russia.